All right, hello everybody, and start out with just a reminder. There's only a few more weeks of class left, and final papers are due May 9th. If anyone has any questions, please do not hesitate to ask me. I'd much rather spend a lot of time answering questions now than see poor grades on final papers because nobody wanted to ask any questions. Please email me, set up a time to talk to me on the phone, whatever works for you. Um, but please ask questions if you have questions about the final paper. All right, so this week we're talking about responses to terrorism, and there's 4 articles this week and no reading from the book. So I chose each of these articles for a purpose because they each bring a unique perspective to the topic. And I'll start the discussion today with the Freilich et al. Article. So in this article, the authors discuss a variety of different techniques that have been used or discussed to prevent or deter terrorism. Now, if you're a criminal justice student, you know there's a long history in criminal justice and criminology, going all the way back to Beccaria, on the belief that deterrence keeps people from committing crimes. So that guided the initial framework for addressing terrorism, where essentially make the punishments harsh enough and it will deter people from doing it. But when it comes to terrorism, results have been kind of mixed, whether or not that actually works. So some research have found that harsh punishments, when they've been meted out, they actually result in more terrorist attacks, or government policies that may create outrage or somehow aggravate certain groups could lead to more terrorist attacks as well. Some authors did find that deterrence works. Those that have, a lot of times it's very specific statutes with very specific outcomes. They weren't more of these broad-based terrorism statutes that we've been talking about, especially like last week we talked about some of those. So then they moved into a discussion of situational crime prevention, and I'm not going to talk much about this right now, about the ins and outs of it, because the Clark and Newman article is 100% about situational crime prevention, and Freilich and others there they do cite the Clark and Newman chapter that I'm going to have that you're supposed to read for this week there too. But situational crime prevention essentially says you have to figure out what attributes or characteristics or whatever are providing opportunities for terrorist attacks, and then you fix those situations so that terrorist attacks are not as likely. So when you're talking about terrorist attacks, a lot of times talking about target hardening, things like that. Now the argument against this is that if you harden targets, they may just displace the terrorists to other softer targets, and not sure that that's really what you want to do. But there's not a lot of support really for this claim in criminological research, because the research on situational crime prevention really only shows displacement in a minority of instances. Then they start talking a little bit about intelligence-led policing, and that's another strategy that can be used to combat terrorism. Intelligence-led policing basically is the gathering of intelligence and sharing of intelligence, and obviously that's of the utmost importance when trying to deter terrorist attacks. And intelligence-led policing has really grown in popularity since 9/11, with all the increased focus on intelligence gathering and intelligence sharing since then. So the next article is Clark and Newman. Now there's no way I'm going to be able to cover everything that's in this article. There's a lot of good information in there. So I was kind of briefly talk about this thing. Clark and Newman have 25 techniques for situational crime prevention that they have in their article. And it's all listed there in table 15.1. So really spend some time kind of going through table 15.1 and looking at what they got in there. But you can pretty much lump those 25 techniques into 5 categories: increase effort, increase the risks, reduce rewards, reduce provocations, and remove excuses. So they talk more about all those different categories and techniques, and then they kind of end their article talking about how do you evaluate strategies. So again, a little bit of a discussion talking about pros and cons of situational crime prevention and intelligence-led policing. So take some time on that one. There's a lot there, a lot to digest, and think about how it relates within the context of the Freilich article. All right, so the next article after that is by Lafree, Dugan, and Miller, and it looks at whether repressive or conciliatory acts are more effective at reducing terrorism. Now, it's easy to say or to want to have repressive laws and punishments for terrorists. I mean, terrorist attacks, terrorist events are horrible, horrible situations. So you have some revenge playing a role here as well. But the authors found that in some instances, some conciliatory actions actually resulted in fewer terrorist attacks. It wasn't the conciliatory acts weren't really viewed as like being soft, which I think is what countries a lot of times were worried about, is that the terrorists are going to see it as like they're giving up or they're being soft, that sort of thing. And they found this especially in Israel. They also looked at Turkey, but in Turkey it was much less pronounced than it was in Israel. And they didn't have nearly as many conciliatory actions, so it was a little bit harder to pull the results out of Turkey. But in Israel, conciliatory actions did seem to result in fewer terrorist attacks. So, I mean, even with those findings, nobody is saying that countries should not punish people that commit terrorist attacks, or they should not punish people that are breaking the law, and that these countries should only adopt conciliatory responses. Right? Nobody's saying that. They're not saying that in the article, and I'm not saying it here. But the article suggests that there could be, more responses to terrorism, possibly than just these repressive type responses that we're used to. So it may be important to have a variety of things in your tool bag instead of just getting more and more repressive as time goes on. Now, these results can only be applied to Israel and Turkey, and they state that in the article because obviously ideologies and situations vary. But these results suggest at least that policymakers might want to consider that there might be different types of responses that may work, and including conciliatory responses. All right, so the final article then is by Perry, Weisberg, and Hassisi. And I'm not going to spend any time on this at all because this article is super straightforward. It's the 10 Commandments of Counterterrorism. So read it, and it can't be any more straightforward than what it is. And I've already spent a lot of time here on this video. So with that, I'm going to stop. Be sure to complete your discussion board and let me know if anybody has any questions. And I'll see you next week.